You may find it hard to believe, but did you know that many old Hollywood celebrities were considered so dumb that even directors, co-actors, and producers were often fed up with them? The only things that kept them in the industry were their beauty, public image, or sheer luck. Today, we're diving into the list of the most clueless actors from the golden age of Hollywood. Stay tuned. You'll be surprised to hear the real reasons behind their fame. Lou Costello. Who's on first? Yes, I mean the fellow's name on first base. Who? The guy on first. Who? If that classic routine left you delightfully confused, you've experienced the genius of Lou Costello, the shorter half of the Abbott and Costello team. Lou's specialty was playing the dim bulb everyman who just can't quite get it. In the famous Who's on First skit, Costello is the exasperated dolt who can't grasp that Who is actually the name of the first baseman, and his escalating frustration as straight man Bud Abbott feeds him perfectly logical but misleading answers is comedy legend. Lou Costello's on-screen persona was that of a childlike, pudgy fellow, amiable but oh so dumb when it came to common sense. He'd often mangle words or get suckered by Abbott's fast-talking cons. His catchphrase, delivered in a whiny, nasally protest, was, "I'm a bad boy," typically after he'd done something particularly idiotic, like accidentally setting Abbott's coattails on fire or unleashing a torrent of chaos. Audiences loved Lou because he made innocence and stupidity hilarious and endearing. Off-camera, Lou Costello was a savvy performer who knew how to get laughs, but his formal education was minimal, and he wasn't known as an intellectual. In fact, Bud Abbott handled most business matters for the duo. Still, Lou's comedic instincts were razor-sharp. One famous example: in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, Lou's character sees the Frankenstein monster in a basement and is so terrified he can barely croak out calls for help. But of course, when he drags Bud to see, the monster has vanished. The audience sees that Lou's fear is justified, but Bud's character thinks he's just being a dumb scaredy cat. That dynamic, Lou being right by accident or intuition, but never believed due to his dumb track record, was a common theme and drove much of the humor. Unfortunately, by the mid-1950s, Abbott and Costello's style of comedy fell out of favor, and they split amid personal tensions. Some said Lou's ego grew, but others pointed out that he endured tragedies that forever darkened his playful spirit. He died in 1959 at just 52. Remembered today, Lou Costello is the quintessential bumbling buddy, the original dumb pal, in a comedy duo that influenced countless acts to come. Anytime a likable lug tries to follow a routine and hilariously mucks it up, you can bet Lou's ghost is smiling, hat askew, shouting, "I'm a bad boy." One more time. Curly Howard. No survey of Hollywood's famous nitwits would be complete without Curly Howard, the most beloved member of the Three Stooges. With his shaved head, bushy eyebrows, and bulldog physique, Curly was the very picture of innocent goofiness. On screen, Curly's character was essentially an overgrown child in a man's body. Full of exuberance, prone to wild impulses, and blissfully ignorant of pretty much everything. He communicated in a symphony of silly sounds that have become legend. Nyuk, nyuk, nyuk! Woob, woob, woob! Barking like a dog, or launching into a high-pitched "Certainly" when asked to do something. Curly could never stay serious for long. Even a simple task like baking a cake would turn into chaos when Curly's dim mind wandered. He'd add an absurd ingredient or start a food fight without quite realizing how it happened. Part of what made Curly so funny was that he operated on pure ID and instinct. He'd see a tassel on a hat and be hypnotically drawn to flick it, regardless of the havoc it caused. If Moe slapped him, Curly might get distracted playing Pop Goes the Weasel on his own face. In one classic gag, a two-man saw pokes Curly in the backside. Lacking any logical deduction, he turns around and angrily confronts Moe. "Hey, cut it out!" Because in Curly's simplistic understanding, Moe must have done something to cause that pain. Despite playing a numbskull, Curly was a gifted physical comedian. His spins, dances, and pratfalls were executed with athletic precision. In Punch Drunk, Curly portrays a mild-mannered soul who becomes a boxing champ whenever he hears "Pop Goes the Weasel." Watching him go from docile to ferociously wild on cue, completely unaware of his own split behavior, is side-splitting, and it takes real talent to do that. Off-screen, Jerome "Curly" Howard was said to be a shy, gentle man, not educated or worldly, but not stupid either. He was just naturally funny and generous. Sadly, his indulgent lifestyle and perhaps the strain of the physical comedy caught up to him. He suffered a stroke in 1946, effectively ending his career, and he passed away in 1952 at age 48. But thanks to endless TV reruns, Curly Howard's spirit lives on as the perennial man-child buffoon. Whenever you hear "nyuk nyuk nyuk" or see someone joyfully acting like an idiot for laughs, you're witnessing Curly's influence. He showed that being the dumb one in a comedy trio could earn you the most love, for Curly was, and remains, everyone's favorite stooge. Huntz Hall. While the Three Stooges and Abbott and Costello were making America laugh in theaters, another group of wisecracking knuckleheads called the Bowery Boys was equally popular, especially with younger audiences. Among them was Huntz Hall, who portrayed Horace Debussy, Satch Jones, arguably the dimmest of the boys. With his derby hat tilted back, toothy grin, and goofy mugging, Huntz Hall's Satch was the ultimate street corner clown. The Bowery Boys films were B-movie comedies through the 1940s and 50s, featuring a gang of New York City pals getting into mischief. Hall's character Sack was the comic relief among them. A lanky, bumbling kid with a high, raspy voice and a laugh like a braying donkey. Sack always had some harebrained scheme or nonsensical observation that made the gang roll their eyes. Whether he was convinced he had turned invisible or trying to milk a cow by sitting underneath and singing to it, Satch's antics were reliably ridiculous. Huntz Hall played dumb with relish, bulging his eyes, flapping his ears, and delivering malapropisms in a machine-gun Brooklyn patter. In one film, Satch proudly declares, "I've been vaccinated for almost everything: smallpox, whooping cough, and the Asiatic bus." The malaprop gag was a staple of his humor, highlighting that Satch kind of knew big words, but never quite got them right. Off-screen, Huntz Hall was a showbiz veteran from childhood, with a canny sense of comedic timing. He and co-star Leo Gorcey churned out dozens of these programmers. Critics sniffed at the lowbrow humor. Admittedly, the plots were thin excuses for pratfalls and shtick, but audiences, especially kids, loved the familiarity of Huntz Hall's lovable dope routine. By the series' end in 1958, Hall had appeared as Satch in 48 Bowery Boys films, an incredible run that basically involved being cheerfully stupid in different scenarios. After the Bowery Boys, Huntz Hall's career quieted down. He was so identified as the overgrown teenager Satch that it was tough to break away. And indeed, he embraced that identity for the rest of his life in nostalgia circuits. Huntz Hall might not be as widely remembered today, but for a generation, he was the affable numbskull they could laugh at and even relate to. After all, who hasn't felt like the dumb friend once in a while? Huntz Hall made that role a source of pride and plenty of good-hearted laughs. Jerry Lewis. If man-child had a patron saint in Hollywood, it would surely be Jerry Lewis. In the 1950s and early 60s, Jerry Lewis perfected the role of the zany, clumsy, over-the-top idiot. A character so broadly drawn that some found him annoying, but millions found him hilarious. Teaming first with Dean Martin and later going solo, Lewis brought a cartoonish level of stupidity to his comedy. Think of his characters as big kids who never learned how to behave or speak normally. He'd mug shamelessly, cross-eyed, buck-toothed, arms flailing, voice cracking into a falsetto whine. In the Colgate Comedy Hour skits, or films like Artists and Models, Jerry played the buffoon to Dean Martin's suave, straight man. A typical bit might involve Jerry as a novice waiter wreaking havoc in a restaurant, tripping over chairs, mixing up orders, dumping soup on a patron's lap, all while jabbering apologies in a goofy voice. It was broad slapstick and farce, and Lewis was a master at it. His most famous solo film role, The Nutty Professor, cleverly split his persona in two. The nerdy, klutzy Professor Kelp and his alter ego Buddy Love, a slick, arrogant crooner. The film allowed Lewis to satirize his own image. When he's Kelp, he's all buck teeth, terrible posture, and absurd naivete, the quintessential dummy who doesn't know how to be cool. Throughout his career, critics often lambasted Lewis's comedy as lowbrow or juvenile. And indeed, some of his gags were unapologetically silly. Like the famous scene in The Bellboy, where he pantomimes typing on an invisible typewriter, or his wordless pantomime of conducting a big band to Count Basie's music in The Errand Boy. But that was precisely his appeal. He tapped into pure, childlike chaos. Kids loved him. Adults who let their inner child loose loved him too. Meanwhile, the French critics hailed him as an auteur of absurdity, perhaps over-intellectualizing the pratfalls, but acknowledging that Lewis created a unique language of screen idiocy. Off-camera, Jerry Lewis was far from a dummy. He was a pioneering filmmaker, an inventor of the video assist, and a famously shrewd businessman. He was also mercurial and demanding, suggesting a complex mind behind the childlike facade. In later years, his reputation took a few hits for off-color remarks and a perceived ego, but his charitable work with the Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon also showed a generous side. Ultimately, Jerry Lewis's enduring image is that of the wide-eyed goofball in too short pants, socks drooping, who just wants to be liked and keeps messing up. His comedy asks us to laugh at his foolishness, yes, but also to empathize with it. Because who among us hasn't felt like a fish out of water, desperately trying to fit in and flubbing it at every step? Jerry Lewis turned that relatable foolishness into an art form. The dumb characters he portrayed were, in their own way, geniuses of comedy. Arthur Lake comic strip fans in the 1930s and 40s flocked to the movies to see Arthur Lake embody one of the most famous, lovable dummies of all time, Dagwood Bumstead. Lake, a Hollywood character actor, struck gold when he was cast as Dagwood in Blondie, the first film adaptation of Chuck Young's popular Blondie comic strip. He went on to play Dagwood in 28 films and a long-running radio show, effectively merging his own identity with that of the hapless, bumbling suburban husband. Dagwood Bumstead is the prototypical, well-meaning dope. He's the guy who can never quite get out the door without tripping over something. Arthur Lake had the lanky physicality and mild-mannered face that fit Dagwood to a T. In the films, Lake's Dagwood is forever screwing up simple household tasks, forgetting important things, and getting in hot water with his sensible wife, Blondie. A typical scenario. Blondie asks Dagwood to handle a minor chore like minding their child or cooking dinner. What could go wrong? Cut to Dagwood inadvertently flooding the house, or losing the baby, or burning the roast to a crisp because he got distracted by something foolish. Lake played these scenes with earnest bewilderment. His Dagwood never means to be incompetent, he's just naturally scatterbrained. Even his speech patterns were delightfully doltish. Dagwood would stammer and repeat himself when flustered, maybe let out one of his trademark yelps of surprise. One running gag had Dagwood dealing with his overbearing boss, Mr. Dithers. Inevitably, Dagwood would bungle an assignment at work, leading to Dithers exploding in anger and Dagwood retreating in fear like a chastened schoolboy. Audiences sympathized with Dagwood's plight. Arthur Lake made him an endearing underdog whose very ineptitude was charming. Off the screen, Arthur Lake was a competent actor, not particularly a clown in real life, but he happily embraced the Dagwood persona. He'd make public appearances with Penny Singleton in character, and even at home, he reportedly answered to Dagwood. He was so identified with the role that when the film series finally ended in 1950, Lake semi-retired. It was hard for anyone to see him as anything but the sandwich-eating, couch-napping, ever-forgetful Dagwood. In a way, Arthur Lake had the last laugh. He secured a place in pop culture history by playing one of the dumbest husbands around. Yet he provided comfort and laughs to audiences navigating their own post-war domestic confusions. Lake proved that sometimes a character with no sense can make a lot of sense to people, reflecting the everyday foibles we all stumble through. Dagwood Bumstead remains an icon of lovable incompetence, thanks largely to Arthur Lake's faithful and funny portrayal of that big-hearted bumbler. Errol Flynn. On the opposite end of the spectrum from domesticated Dagwood stands Errol Flynn, a matinee idol whose off-screen adventures and questionable decisions made many label him less than brilliant. Flynn was the swashbuckling star of classics like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, where he played heroes full of charm, daring, and wit. But in real life, Flynn developed a reputation as a hard-drinking, thrill-seeking rogue who rarely troubled himself with deep thinking or caution. If dumb can sometimes mean foolish, Flynn's life had that in spades. As a youth in Tasmania and London, he was expelled from multiple schools for various misbehavior. He later bragged it was for bedding a school laundress, though officially it was for theft. He ran off to New Guinea as a teenager to hunt for gold and adventure, nearly dying of malaria and mishaps. Flynn seemed to barrel through life guided by hedonism and impulse rather than intellect or responsibility. In Hollywood, Flynn became infamous for his antics. He loved alcohol, often starting the day with a shot of whiskey, and he partied relentlessly. His escapades with women were legend, and landed him in serious trouble in 1943 when he was accused of statutory rape by two underage girls. The scandalous trial splashed his salacious private life across headlines, although he was ultimately acquitted. Still, the ordeal marked him as reckless. Flynn also dove into ventures beyond acting that some called foolhardy, sailing the globe on his yacht, getting entangled in Cuban politics, and even trying to start his own production company when his star waned, which failed, costing him dearly. By middle age, Flynn's excesses left him a bloated, dissipated version of his former self. He openly admitted that he was no intellectual. In fact, he titled his raucous autobiography My Wicked, Wicked Ways, wearing his scoundrel reputation as a badge of honor. In one anecdote, a snobby LA country club supposedly denied him membership because he was an actor. Flynn quipped in response, "I'm no actor. and I have 64 films to prove it," acknowledging with a wink that he coasted on charisma more than thespian skill. That quip shows there was some self-aware wit in Flynn, but by and large he disdained studiousness or caution. Women, gin, and cigarettes were his priorities. He once joked, "This devil-may-care attitude made for a short, tumultuous life." He died of a heart attack at just 50, his body worn out by years of abuse. Was Errol Flynn dumb? Not in the sense of IQ. He was articulate and could be charmingly clever when he wanted. But in the arena of life choices, Flynn often seemed to lack wisdom or foresight, pursuing immediate pleasure at the expense of everything else. In Hollywood lore, he's less remembered for any scholarly pursuits and more for being the poster boy of self-indulgent, live fast, die young foolishness. Yet, one can't deny he lived fully. If anything, Errol Flynn exemplifies that being book-smart or sensible isn't a prerequisite for being adored. Sometimes sheer bravado and a flair for adventure write a legend larger than life. Smarts be damned. Victor Mature. Tall, dark, and brawny, Victor Mature was a 1940s leading man who often got tagged as not the sharpest tool in the shed, even by himself. Mature was a handsome hunk cast in many sword and sandal epics and film noirs, known more for his physique and presence than for acting chops. Critics in the day poked fun at his limited range, some insinuating that his acting was as wooden as the props. Mature didn't particularly disagree. In fact, he famously had a great sense of humor about his own talent. One oft-quoted anecdote: when denied membership to a country club because he was an actor, Mature wryly responded, "I'm not an actor, and I've got 64 films to prove it." This self-deprecating crack became legend and endeared him to many. It showed Mature was fully aware of his himbo image, a handsome lug who wasn't to be taken too seriously. Mature's roles tended to emphasize brawn over brains. He played biblical strongman Samson in Samson and Delilah, spending most of the film flexing and looking perplexed until brought down by a deceitful woman. He also portrayed a caveman in 1 million BC and a circus muscle man in The Big Circus. Even in noirs like I Wake Up Screaming, he was the beefy protagonist caught in a mystery, not the guy delivering rapid-fire witty dialogue. Off-screen, Mature carried a reputation for being carefree and a bit lazy about the craft. He reportedly once fell asleep on set when he was supposed to be playing dead, a literal sleeping beauty. Another time, during Samson and Delilah, asked if he found it embarrassing to be filmed shirtless and shackled in a scene where Samson pushes down the temple, he quipped that the only thing embarrassing him was having to pretend to be serious. Some mistook this laid-back attitude for stupidity or lack of dedication. In truth, Mature just didn't have pretensions about acting as high art. He often said he was in it for the money and fun, not to win awards. That said, he delivered solid performances when needed. His turn as Doc Holliday in My Darling Clementine is actually nuanced and tragic, showing there was more to him than he got credit for. Still, by the late 50s, Mature semi-retired, content to enjoy life rather than chase roles. He once joked that he quit movies because he got tired of dying in every film. Perhaps the ultimate Victor Mature story came when Cecil B. DeMille wanted to cast him in The 10 Commandments. Someone reportedly questioned Mature's acting ability for the lofty biblical epic, to which DeMille replied, "I have told Moses to pick up the tablets. I have not asked him to write them." In other words, Mature would do just fine. It's a cheeky backhanded compliment. He had the presence to play larger-than-life figures. No need for method acting or great intellect there. Victor Mature embraced the idea that he was a big, gorgeous galoot. By leaning into that persona, He escaped the ego traps many actors fell into and left behind a trove of enjoyable films. He proved that sometimes being a dumb actor, one who doesn't overthink things, can lead to a smart career move. Less stress, more laughs, and a likable legacy. Johnny Weissmuller. When it comes to typecasting, Johnny Weissmuller is a case study. Here was an Olympic gold medalist swimmer turned actor who will forever be associated with one role, Tarzan. And Tarzan, the ape man, is not exactly known for eloquent discourse or intellectual endeavors. Weissmuller donned the loincloth in 12 films from 1932 to 1948, swinging on vines, wrestling wild animals, and famously uttering only a few words of broken English. His portrayal was so iconic that for decades, people imitated his trademark yodel-like Tarzan yell and assumed Weissmuller himself might be a bit primal. In truth, Weissmuller wasn't dumb per se, but he was a man of physicality, not verbosity. After emigrating from what is now Romania as a child, he became a swimming champion in the 1920s, setting world records. He wasn't book-educated, but he had discipline and athletic intelligence in the pool. Hollywood snapped him up for Tarzan precisely because of his physique and athletic prowess. Acting ability was secondary. In the Tarzan films, Weissmuller's lines were minimal. He mostly had to look heroic, emit that piercing jungle call, and carry Maureen O'Sullivan around the treetops. His natural charisma made the simplistic character lovable. But after so many years grunting and wrestling fake crocodiles, Weissmuller found it nearly impossible to be seen as anything else. Off-screen, he was mild-mannered and affable, but fans expected him to thump his chest and do the yell on command. He obliged at appearances, but it must have been odd. Outside of Tarzan, he spoke normally, with a slight accent and a gentle demeanor. One can imagine casting directors not considering him for roles requiring heavy dialogue or sophistication. Tarzan had defined him. Post-Tarzan, Weissmuller played a similar jungle hero, Jungle Jim, in a series of bee adventures, essentially trading one loincloth for another. Still, it was all squarely in the action man wheelhouse. As he aged, Weissmuller struggled. Unlike some actors who broke free of dumb roles, he could not reinvent himself. By the 1960s, health issues and financial troubles plagued him. In his later years, afflicted by heart problems and perhaps dementia, there are poignant tales of him standing on his apartment balcony and doing the Tarzan yell to summon help, blurring the line between the role and the man in a tragic way. Johnny Weissmuller's legacy is bittersweet. On one hand, he brought dignity and athletic grace to a character that could have been pure camp. He made Tarzan believable and beloved. On the other hand, Tarzan's limited vocabulary and uncivilized nature stuck to Weissmuller like a second skin, making many assume he wasn't much more than the sum of that role. And maybe he wasn't a great actor in the classical sense, but he didn't need to be. As Tarzan, he communicated through action. The braininess of a role mattered less than the brawn, and Weissmuller delivered. So while he might be listed among Hollywood's dumb actors in jest, it's more accurate to say he's among those who played simplistic characters too well. He sacrificed a broader career to become an icon. And if Tarzan is the only language people remember him speaking, well, that ululating jungle cry is worth 1,000 words. Sonny Tufts. Every so often, a performer becomes famous almost because they're considered not so bright or not so talented. In the 1940s, Sonny Tufts was one such oddball case, a Harvard-educated scion of a well-to-do family who nonetheless gained a reputation in Hollywood as, frankly, a bit of a dope. Tufts had a promising start. He debuted in 1943 opposite Veronica Lake in So Proudly We Hail, and was initially pegged as a tall, handsome leading man. But unlike more polished peers, Sonny's acting was, let's say, stiff. He had a genial demeanor, but often came across as clueless or sleepy on camera, lacking the charisma to carry romantic or heroic roles. By the late 40s, his star had faded, and then his off-screen escapades took center stage. Sonny Tufts became more infamous for his barroom antics and scandals than for his films. One notorious incident. In 1950, he allegedly bit a stripper's ear at a Boston nightclub in a drunken stupor, an episode that splashed his name across tabloids as a Hollywood goofball run amok. The public started to see Tufts as a punchline. The very name Sonny Tufts had a comedic ring and was used in jokes as shorthand for a washed-up, clueless actor. In fact, a Bugs Bunny cartoon from the era and other pop culture references dropped his name purely for a laugh, assuming audiences would get the reference that he was a joke of a movie star. Back in Hollywood, Tufts couldn't shake the stigma. He took whatever roles he could get, which increasingly meant self-parody. In the 1952 comedy Son of Paleface, Bob Hope included a sight gag involving an inept cowboy character blatantly named Junior Tufts, a rib at Sonny. To his credit, Sonny Tufts gamely appeared as himself in a 1957 episode of The Bob Cummings Show, playing up his dopey image as a faded star. But behind the humor lay a sad reality. Alcohol and poor judgment had derailed his career. He continued acting in B-movies, but mostly as a caricature of his former leading man self. By the time he died in 1970, Tufts was largely forgotten, except as an old Hollywood in-joke. So why include Sonny Tufts in a list of dumb Hollywood actors? Because he illustrates how, in Hollywood, reputation can snowball. Was Tufts truly unintelligent? Perhaps not. He attended Harvard after all. But the combination of mediocre acting, publicized blunders, and willingness to mock himself cemented the perception that he wasn't the brightest bulb. He's a case where the legend overtook the reality of a man who probably started out earnest and capable. Sonny Tufts became, in essence, a meme of his time, a living cautionary punchline showing how quickly Tinseltown can turn on you and label you a fool. His legacy is a smirk and a headshake, the answer to trivial questions and the butt of jokes, proving that fame can sometimes curdle into a kind of infamy that no one would envy. Ed Wood. No list of Hollywood's notorious incompetents would be complete without Edward D. Ed Wood, Jr., often dubbed the worst director of all time. But Ed Wood wasn't just behind the camera. He wrote, produced, and even acted in many of his films, making himself a one-man show of wonderfully awful movie-making. His inclusion here is a bit of a twist. Unlike others who were considered dumb for their persona or antics, Ed Wood is considered dumb for the quality of his work, earnest as it was. In the 1950s, Ed Wood had big Hollywood dreams and microscopic budgets. The result? Movies like Glenn or Glenda and Plan 9 from Outer Space that are so technically and narratively inept, they've become cult comedies. Wood himself often took roles in these films. In Glenn or Glenda, he played the cross-dressing protagonist, delivering hilariously stilted narration about his Angora sweater fetish. In Plan 9, he didn't act on screen, but his clumsy fingerprints are everywhere. From the wobbling gravestones to the absurd dialogue like, "Future events such as these will affect you in the future." The acting from his cast is uniformly over-the-top or wooden, and yet one imagines Ed behind the camera enthusiastically shouting, "Perfect! Print it!" Wood's lack of technical skill and obliviousness to normal storytelling logic made people think he was a cinematic idiot. One scene in Plan 9 shows daytime suddenly switching to midnight and back to day, in the same sequence. Any competent filmmaker would reshoot or edit around such glaring continuity problems, but Ed Wood either didn't notice or didn't care. For years, he was an object of ridicule. The book The Golden Turkey Awards crowned Plan 9 as worst film ever, and Wood as worst director. However, in a weird way, Ed Wood's naive dumbness had a charm. He was undeniably passionate. Arguably, it takes a kind of genius to persevere in making movies with no money, no talent, and no studio backing, purely fueled by delusional confidence and love of film. His earnestness shines through the laughable results, giving them an endearing quality. Tim Burton's acclaimed 1994 biopic Ed Wood actually reframed him not as a fool to mock, but as a sort of folk hero of outsiders, a man whose optimism was impervious to reality. Still, let's be clear, by normal measures of cinematic art, Ed Wood was hilariously inept. He typed out terrible scripts in record time, filmed in single takes, and printed the first draft of everything. His magnum opus Plan 9 from Outer Space features aliens who inexplicably speak English, cardboard UFOs on strings, and Bela Lugosi's final performance cobbled together from silent B-roll. The result is a movie that makes audiences howl with laughter at its sheer incompetence, the polar opposite of its earnest intent about grave robbers and zombies. Ed Wood's story is both comedic and tragic. He died in 1978, years before he was posthumously famous. At the time, he was an unemployed alcoholic who had drifted into writing porn to pay rent. One can only imagine his astonishment if he knew that today, Plan 9 is adored at midnight screenings worldwide, and that he's achieved a kind of immortality through his so bad it's good legacy. In the final analysis, Ed Wood was a terrible filmmaker, yes, possibly the dumbest director Hollywood ever saw in terms of craft. But his sheer zeal and the unintended hilarity of his films have granted him a folk fame that more competent but boring artists never attain. It's a reminder that in showbiz, sometimes failing spectacularly is more memorable than mediocrity. Ed Wood's ineptitude made him legend, the ultimate proof that being smart isn't a prerequisite for being unforgettable. Tor Johnson. If you ever catch a glimpse of a bald, hulking figure grunting his way through a 1950s B-horror movie, you might be watching Tor Johnson, a man who made a career out of playing the big dumb brute. Johnson was a Swedish professional wrestler turned actor, and he certainly looked the part of an ogre, weighing around 400 pounds, with a completely bald head, blank white eyes, and a lumbering gait. His characters typically had names like Lobo or Hugo, and they rarely spoke more than a word or two. If they did, it was in a strained, barely intelligible mumble through his thick Scandinavian accent. Tor Johnson's most famous appearances were in schlocky flicks, often directed by our previous subject, Ed Wood. In Bride of the Monster, Johnson plays Lobo, the mute henchman of Bela Lugosi's mad scientist. He spends the film dutifully doing Lugosi's bidding, strangling victims, lugging bodies around, while occasionally getting scolded like a dim-witted child. When Lobo finally rebels, it's because the one thing he loves is harmed, sending him into a confused fury. It's the classic Frankenstein's monster trope, and Tor fit it perfectly. Enormous, strong, and monosyllabic. Ed Wood brought Tor back as a zombified ghoul in Plan 9 from Outer Space. There, even as an undead grave dweller, Tor basically played, well, himself. A wordless mountain of a man, staggering after heroes with outstretched arms. It wasn't high art, But Tor Johnson's peculiar screen presence made him a minor cult figure. Outside of Wood's oeuvre, Johnson popped up in other B-movies and even comedies, always capitalizing on his imposing look. In The Beast of Yucca Flats, he starred as a defecting Soviet scientist caught in a nuclear blast, turned into a mute, radiation-scarred beast who preys on innocence. It's a bizarre, nearly narration-only film where Tor does little but wander and grunt, which pretty much sums up his range. Off-camera, Johnson was said to be a gentle, jovial guy, quite the opposite of his frightening characters. He even had a family and would go trick-or-treating with his kids, to the reported terror of neighbors who opened their door to a genuine movie monster. In the 1960s, Tor's cult status led to something amusing. His face became a popular Halloween mask. If you walked into a costume shop back then, you might see a rubber mask simply labeled Tor Johnson, because his visage itself was essentially a monster icon. That's a kind of fame built entirely on looking like the stereotypical dumb brute. By the time Tim Burton's Ed Wood film came out in 1994, portraying Tor as a lovable lug struggling to get through a doorway on set, the world had enshrined Johnson as an endearing footnote in Hollywood's Hall of Oddities. Tor Johnson was never a skilled actor. He delivered exactly what was expected: physical bulk and a vacant stare. But he embraced it fully. In a sense, he made being the dumb monster into an art form of its own. His lack of dialogue or complexity was the whole point. And in that simplicity lies his charm. He happily gave the audience the big, scary dummy they wanted, and in return got a taste of silver screen immortality. If that's not a smart trade, it's at least a pretty entertaining one.